Take your index finger right now and place it exactly between your eyes, right at the top of your nose. Press down. You feel that? There is a distinct, undeniable indentation, a dip. In anatomy, this is called the nasion, the precise point where your frontal bone meets your nasal bone. It acts as a biological step that separates your forehead from your nose. This depression is a defining characteristic of Homo sapiens. Every single person watching this video has it. It is the hallmark of our species' skull structure. But if you walk into the Louvre Museum today or look at a verified high-resolution scan of an ancient Greek bust, you will see something that defies this biology. You won't just see a straight nose. You will see a monolithic, continuous line of bone that flows from the hairline to the nose tip without a single millimeter of deviation. No dip. No indentation. No nasion. For centuries, art historians have dismissed this as the Greek ideal, a stylistic choice made by sculptors to make leaders look godlike. They tell us it wasn't real. But if it was just a style, why does this exact same anatomical anomaly appear on the death masks of European kings in the 1700s? Why does it appear on the official currency of the United States until exactly 1909? And why, when we dig up skulls from the royal necropolises of Peru and Malta, do we find bone structures that match this impossible profile perfectly? We aren't looking at an artistic choice. We are looking at a biological signature. By the end of this video, I am going to present a forensic case that suggests the ruling class of human civilization for the last 3,000 years may not have been fully human, at least not as we define it today. We are going to trace a timeline that ends abruptly in the early 20th century, marking the extinction or the hiding of a specific subspecies of ruler. I'm not asking you to believe in aliens or magic. I am asking you to look at the anatomy. We will examine the medical impossibility of the classical profile, reveal the strange synchronized disappearance of this face from global power in 1909, and look at the physical skulls that museums keep in their back rooms. But to understand the truth, we have to start at the moment they vanished. History books tell us that the early 20th century was a time of political revolution. Monarchies fell, democracies rose, and the industrial world took over. But if you look closer, something else happened during this transition. A biological erasure occurred right in front of our eyes, stamped onto the very money people used to buy bread. Let's look at the currency of the United States. Money is the ultimate symbol of state authority. The face on a coin isn't just a drawing. It is the approved, standardized representation of power. If you pick up an Indian head cent minted in 1908, look closely at the profile. The figure, meant to represent liberty wearing a headdress, possesses a terrifyingly straight profile. The forehead transitions into the nose in a perfect geometric line. There is absolutely no bridge. This wasn't a mistake. This was the standard for American currency for decades. Now, fast forward just 1 year to 1909. The Lincoln penny is introduced. Suddenly, the profile changes. Abraham Lincoln is depicted with a deep, realistic human indentation at the bridge of his nose. The divine line is gone. It is replaced by the human dip. You might say, well, that's just a change in artistic direction. They moved from an idealized liberty to a real president. But this shift didn't just happen in America. It happened simultaneously across the globe. In the coin catalogues of the British Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the late 19th century marks a frantic shift toward realism. The profiles of monarchs, which for centuries had been depicted with that distinct high bridge, straight line architecture, suddenly began to soften. They became more human. Why? Why did the artistic guilds of the entire world suddenly decide that the straight profile was no longer the standard of power? The timing is suspicious. The years leading up to World War I saw the dismantling of the old dynastic orders. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, these ancient bloodlines that had ruled for centuries were being systematically removed from the chessboard. It is almost as if a specific phenotype, a specific look that had signified authority since the days of the pharaohs, was being scrubbed from the visual record. They didn't just lose their thrones, they lost their representation. The human dip became the new face of power. The no-bridge profile was relegated to museums and labeled as mythology. But here is where the official narrative cracks. We are told these ancient profiles were stylized, that the artists were just flattering their kings by making them look like Greek statues. But have you ever tried to flatter someone by drawing them with a completely different skull structure? If you painted a portrait of a modern president and removed their nose bridge, they wouldn't look idealized. They would look deformed. They would look alien. Renaissance painters like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael were obsessed with anatomy. Da Vinci dissected over 30 human corpses just to understand how muscles connected to bone. He was a man of science and observation. Are we really supposed to believe that when he painted the aristocracy of the 1500s, he simply forgot how a human skull works? Look at Da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine. Look at the profiles in Raphael's works. They show that same specific architecture, a high vertical forehead that slides effortlessly into the nose. These painters were capturing reality. They were painting what they saw sitting in front of them. And what they saw was a class of people who looked biologically distinct from the peasants working in the fields. The no-bridge trait wasn't a style. It was a class marker. It was the physical proof of blue blood. And up until the early 1900s, this trait was visible, celebrated, and minted in gold. Then, the 20th century arrived, and the world decided that only standard humans exist. The statues were categorized as art. The old coins were melted down or collected as curiosities, and the history books were rewritten to make us believe we have always been ruled by people who looked exactly like us. But the earth doesn't lie. While we can argue about paintings and coins, we cannot argue with bone. To understand who these people were, we have to leave the art galleries and go into the archaeological archives, specifically to the skulls that confirm this impossible face was real. It is easy to lie with a paintbrush. A portrait artist can smooth a wrinkle, straighten a nose, or make a king look more heroic. Skeptics have used this argument for decades to dismiss the no-bridge anomaly. They say, look, these rulers were ugly or inbred, and the artists just fixed them on canvas. It's a comfortable explanation. It keeps our version of history safe. But you cannot lie with calcium. You cannot Photoshop a skull that has been sitting in the dry earth for 2,000 years. And this is where the artistic style theory completely falls apart. When we examine the archaeological record, we don't just find statues with this profile. We find the people themselves. And the anatomy they left behind reveals a terrifying truth. The divine profile was not a cosmetic invention. It was a skeletal reality. You have probably heard of cranial deformation. It is a well-documented practice where ancient cultures, from the Huns in Europe to the Mayans in Central America, would bind the heads of their infants with boards or cloth to elongate the skull. Mainstream historians love this explanation. Whenever someone points out a strange, elongated skull in a museum, they immediately say, "Oh, that's just head binding. Mystery solved." But there is a massive logical hole in that explanation that almost no one talks about. Head binding is a mechanical process. It can change the shape of the skull vault, pushing it backwards or upwards, but it cannot, I repeat, it cannot change the genetic architecture of the face. No amount of binding can erase the nasion. You can squeeze a baby's head for 10 years, but you cannot force the frontal bone to fuse perfectly with the nasal bone to create a flat, straight line. That dip at the bridge of the nose is determined by genetics, not external pressure. Yet, when we look at the skulls found in the Paracas region of Peru, or the ancient burials in Malta's hypogeum, we see skulls that possess both features. They are incredibly elongated, yes, but they also lack the brow ridges and the nasal indentation that defines modern Homo sapiens. If these people were just normal humans who bound their heads to look like the gods, why did their faces also match the gods? You can mimic a shape, but you cannot mimic a biological lack of bone structure. This suggests that the practice of head binding by common people was a cargo cult, an attempt by the ordinary population to imitate the natural physical appearance of a ruling elite that was biologically different from them. The masses were trying to look like the masters. The global mosaic of the nosed minority. The deeper you dig, the more global this genetic network becomes. This wasn't an isolated mutation in a single village. It was a worldwide phenomenon. Let's travel to ancient Egypt. Look at the period of Akhenaten. Traditional Egyptologists call his reign the Amarna period and describe the art as grotesque or exaggerated. They say Akhenaten suffered from Marfan syndrome or some other glandular disorder. But look at his statues. Look at the statues of his daughters. They all display the signature, the elongated skull, and the perfect, terrifyingly straight line from forehead to nose. Now, fly 4,000 miles east to Afghanistan. In the Hada archaeological site, we find the Genius of the Flowers sculpture. It depicts a figure with the exact same facial geometry. Continue to the jungles of Palenque in Mexico, and you see Lord Pakal, the great Maya ruler. His relief carvings show the specific no-bridge profile. Are we supposed to believe that cultures separated by vast oceans, with no supposed contact, all decided to independently invent the exact same specific artistic lie? That is statistically impossible. The more logical, albeit disturbing, conclusion is that they weren't inventing anything. They were documenting a ruling class that spanned the globe, a transcontinental elite that shared a specific genetic marker. They were few, and the subject populations were many, but they held the reins of civilization. The blue blood survival, the royal connection. So if this species or subspecies ruled the ancient world, where did they go? Did they vanish when Rome fell? No. They simply changed their titles. They went from being god-kings to divine right monarchs. If we fast forward to the Europe of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we find that the ruling families were obsessed with purity of blood. We are taught that this was about political alliances and keeping land within the family. But what if the purity they were protecting was biological? Take a hard look at the Habsburg dynasty. We all know about the Habsburg jaw, the protruding chin caused by generations of inbreeding. It's the famous genetic defect of the family. But focus higher up the face. Look at the portraits of Emperor Leopold I or Charles II of Spain. Look past the jaw. Look at the nose. They possess the profile, the high sloping forehead, the massive straight nose, the lack of a bridge. This wasn't just inbreeding in the sense of random errors. It looks like the desperate attempt to preserve a specific set of traits. They were breeding to keep the god-king phenotype alive. They were trying to stop their blood from being diluted by the common human genome. The royal houses of Europe, the Bourbons, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, were effectively one single, large biological clan. They called each other cousin, not just out of politeness, but because they were genetically distinct from the populations they ruled. The Russian case study. Let's look at the Romanovs in Russia. Official history tells us Peter the Great was a reformer who modernized Russia. But look at his death mask. Look at the portraits painted from life. He is a giant of a man, over 6 feet 7 inches tall, with a facial structure that is undeniably classical. His mother, Natalia Narishkina, has a profile that could have been carved into a Roman coin. This wasn't a Russian peasant face. This was the face of the international elite. Even his wife, Catherine I, who historians claim was a commoner of unknown origin, displays the trait in her ceremonial portraits. This suggests a chilling possibility. The bride shows of the Russian czars, where they supposedly picked a beautiful girl from the nobility, might have been a genetic screening process. They weren't looking for beauty in the modern sense. They were looking for the markers. They were checking the bone structure to ensure the bride carried the specific genetic code required to produce an heir with the right to rule, the dilution and the vanishing. But biology is a numbers game. You can only fight the tide of dominant genetics for so long. By the late 19th century, the pure strain was failing. If you line up the portraits of the Tsars or the kings of England chronologically, you see the degradation. In the 1600s and 1700s, the no-bridge profile is sharp and aggressive. By the mid-1800s, it begins to soften. The forehead starts to curve. A small indentation appears at the nose. The human genes are winning. By the time we get to Nicholas II of Russia or George V of England in the early 1900s, they look almost normal. They look like us. The distinct alien architecture has faded into a mere family resemblance. And this brings us back to 1909. Why did the coins change? Why did the art style shift? Because the reality had changed. The pure-blooded ancient rulers were effectively extinct. The biological line had been diluted to the point where they could no longer claim to be physical gods. They had become men. And once they became men, they became vulnerable. It is no coincidence that the moment this specific facial feature fades from the royal bloodlines is the exact same moment the monarchies began to fall. The divine right was based on being different. Once they looked like everyone else, the spell was broken. But did they really just disappear? Or did the remnants of this bloodline realize that being visible was dangerous? In the final part of this video, we are going to look at the modern world. We will ask the uncomfortable question, did this lineage truly die out? Or did they simply retreat from the throne room to the boardroom? And are there still people walking among us today who carry the no-bridge gene? The answer might be staring at you from the cover of a business magazine. The year 1909 didn't just mark a change in coinage. It marked a fundamental shift in the strategy of power. For 5,000 years, the nosed minority, this biologically distinct elite, ruled openly. They sat on high thrones, wore heavy crowns, and demanded that we worship their image. Their physical difference was their greatest asset. It was the visual proof that they were above us. But the 20th century brought a new threat: the camera, the mass media, the vote. The world was becoming smaller, and the common people were becoming more observant. The biological separation that once commanded awe began to provoke suspicion. If you look too different in a democratic age, you don't get worshipped. You get overthrown. So, the strategy changed. They stopped being kings and emperors. They became bankers, industrialists, and media moguls. The camouflage of the modern elite. If we look at the transition of power in the early 1900s, we see the rise of families whose names replaced the Windsors and the Romanovs in terms of actual global influence. We are talking about the dynasties of finance. And while the genetic line has undoubtedly been diluted by marriages with standard humans over the last century, the traits haven't completely vanished. They have just become recessive. Occasional echoes of the old blood still surface. If you look at candid photographs of the patriarchs of certain banking families from the mid-20th century, figures who preferred to stay out of the limelight, you can still spot the anomaly. The heavy, sloping forehead, the fierce, predator-like gaze. And yes, in certain angles, that distinct, unbroken line of the nose. It is no longer as pure as it was in the statues of Pharaoh Akhenaten. It is fading. But the biological signature remains faint, like a watermark on old paper. It suggests that while the god-kings may have left the palaces, their descendants moved into the skyscrapers. They realized that true power isn't about wearing a crown. It's about controlling the currency. And interestingly, the moment they took control of the central banks was the exact same moment they removed their faces from the coins. They went invisible. The uncanny valley instinct. This theory also explains a deep, primal instinct that every human being possesses. It is called the uncanny valley. Robotics experts and psychologists have long been puzzled by this phenomenon. It is a biological alarm system in our brains. When we see something that looks almost human but is slightly off, like a robot or a wax figure, we feel an immediate visceral sense of revulsion and fear. Evolutionarily, this makes no sense. Why would we evolve a fear of something that looks mostly like us? Unless at some point in our ancient evolutionary past we coexisted with a predator that looked almost human, but wasn't. If a separate subspecies of hominid, more intelligent, more organized, and physically distinct, hunted or enslaved our ancestors, then the uncanny valley isn't a glitch. It's a survival mechanism. Our brains are hardwired to recognize that specific wrongness in a face, because for thousands of years, that face meant danger. That face meant you were in the presence of a master. The no-bridge profile triggers this ancient memory. When we look at those Greek statues, or the cold stares of certain historical figures, we don't feel warmth. We feel a cold, respectful distance. That is the biological memory of a subject species looking at a ruling species. The scientific possibility, Homo capensis? Skeptics will scream conspiracy. But let's look at the hard science. We used to think Homo sapiens was the only smart hominid. We were wrong. In just the last few decades, we discovered the Denisovans, the Homo floresiensis, hobbits, and verified that Neanderthals interbred with us. The human family tree is much more crowded than we thought. Is it scientifically impossible that another branch survived? A branch that didn't focus on physical strength like the Neanderthals, but on cranial capacity? A branch with elongated skulls and different facial architecture. Neuroscientists tell us that the nasion indentation exists in humans because our frontal lobes developed in a specific way. If a species had a larger or differently structured frontal cortex, the seat of long-term planning and strategy, it is anatomically plausible that their skull would push forward, erasing the nose bridge. Perhaps the divine kings were simply a branch of humanity that evolved for hyper-intelligence and strategy. They didn't have magic powers. They just had better hardware. They outsmarted us, domesticated us, and built civilizations on our backs. And when the population of standard humans became too large to control with force, they simply integrated into the system they built. Summary: the 1909 erasure. So let's look at the timeline one last time. For millennia, this group rules openly. Their faces are on the Sphinx, the Parthenon, and the coins of Rome. In the Middle Ages, they retreat into the royal bloodlines, protecting their genetics through intense inbreeding. In the Renaissance, artists like Da Vinci document them with photographic realism. But by the late 1800s, the genetic line is thinning. The world is democratizing. The divine right is dying. And then in 1909, the tipping point. The decision is made. The alien profile is scrubbed from the currency. The art style shifts to realism. The history books are standardized to erase the distinction. The no-bridge anomaly is declared a myth. The skulls are hidden in museum basements. The story is over. Or is it? Go to a mirror, touch the bridge of your nose. Feel that indentation. That is the mark of your species. It connects you to billions of other humans. But the next time you see a news report about the global elite, or you watch a summit of world leaders, look closely. Look past the expensive suits and the rehearsed smiles. Look at the profile. Because while they may have erased the image from the coins, biology is harder to hide. The timeline didn't end in 1909. It just went underground. And if you know what to look for, you might realize that the gods never left. They are just managing the portfolio. Now, I want you to do something for me. I want you to open a new tab and search for 1908 Indian head penny and compare it to a 1909 Lincoln penny. Look at the noses. Then come back here and tell me in the comments, is that just an artistic choice or are you looking at a cover-up? This investigation is just the tip of the iceberg. We have only scratched the surface of the forbidden anthropology that museums don't want you to see. I am currently digging into the archives of the Vatican and the Smithsonian to find the rest of the puzzle pieces. If this video made you question even one page of your history textbook, then you need to subscribe right now. Why? Because the algorithm tries to bury this kind of analysis. But this community is digging it back up.